The Canadian, The Land of Promise, a novelization of W. Somerset Maugham's play, D. Talbot. First part. Chapter 1. Nora opened her eyes to an unaccustomed consciousness of well-being. She was dimly aware that it had its origin in something deeper than mere physical comfort. But for the moment, in that state between sleeping and wakening which still held her, it was enough to find that body and mind seemed rested. Youth was reasserting itself, and it was only a short time ago that she had felt that never, never could she by any possible chance feel young again. When one is young, one resents the reaction after any strain not purely physical, as if it were a premature symptom of old age. A ray of brilliant sunshine, which found its way through a gap in the drawn curtains, showed that it was long past the usual hour for rising. She smiled whimsically and closed her eyes once more. She remembered now that she was not in her own little room in the other wing of the house. The curtains proved that. How often in the 10 years she had been with Miss Wickham had she begged that the staring white window blind, which decorated her one window, be replaced by curtains or even a blind of a dark tone, that she might not be awakened by the first ray of light. She had even ventured to propose that the cost of such alterations be stopped out of her salary. Miss Wickham had refused to countenance any such innovation. 3 years before, when the offending blind had refused to hold together any longer, Nora had had a renewal of hope. But no, the new blind had been more glaringly white than its predecessor, which by contrast had taken on a grateful ivory tone in its old age. They had had one of their rare scenes at its advent. Nora had as a rule an admirable control of her naturally quick temper. But this had been too much. I might begin to understand your refusal if you ever entered my room, but since it would no more occur to you to do so than to visit the stables, I cannot see what possible difference it can make, Nora had stormed. Miss Wickham's smile, which at the beginning of her companion's outburst had been faintly ironic, had broadened into the frankly humorous. Stated with your characteristic regard for exactitude, my dear Miss Marsh, it would never enter my head to do either. I prefer the white blind, however. As you know, I have no taste for explanations. We will let the matter rest there, if you please. Then she had added, some day, I strongly suspect, some man will amuse himself breaking that fiery temper of yours. I wish I were not so old. I think that I should enjoy knowing that he had succeeded. And the incident had ended, as always, with a few angry tears on Nora's part, as a preliminary to the inevitable game of bezique, which finished off each happy day. And this had been her life for 10 years. A wave of pity, not for herself, but for that young girl of 18 who had once been herself, that proudly confident young creature who, when suddenly deprived of the protection of her only parent, Nora's father had died when she was too young to remember him, had so bravely faced the world, serene in the consciousness that the happiness which was her right was sure to be hers after a little waiting, dimmed her eyes for a moment. The dreams she had dreamed after she had received Miss Wickham's letter offering her the post of companion. She recalled how she had smiled to herself when the agent with whom she had filed her application congratulated her warmly on her good fortune in placing herself so promptly and, by way of benediction, had wished that she might hold the position for many years. Many years indeed. That had been no part of her plan. Those nebulous plans had always been consistently rose-colored. It was impossible to remember them all now. Sometimes the unknown Miss Wickham turned out to be a soft-hearted and sentimental old lady who was completely won by her young companion's charm and unmistakable air of good breeding. After a short time, she either adopted her or, on dying, left her her entire fortune. Again, she proved to be a perfect ogre. In this variation, it was always the Prince Charming that looms large in every young girl's dreams, who finally, after a brief period of unhappiness, came to the rescue and everything ended happily, if somewhat conventionally. The reality had been sadly different. Miss Wickham had disclosed herself as being a hard, self-centered, worldly woman who considered that in furnishing her young companion with board, lodging, and a salary of £30 a year, she had, to use a commercial phrase, obtained the option on her every waking hour, and indeed, during the last year of her life, she had extended this option to cover many of the hours which should have been dedicated to rest and sleep. All the fine plans that the young Nora had made while journeying down from London to Tunbridge Wells for going on with her music, improving herself in French, and perhaps taking up another modern language in her leisure hours, had been nipped in the bud before she had been an inmate of Miss Wickham's house many days. She had no leisure hours. Miss Wickham saw to that. She had apparently an abhorrence for her own unrelieved society that amounted to a positive mania. She must never be left alone. Let Nora but escape to her own little room, in the vain hope of obtaining a few moments to herself, and Kate, the parlour maid, was certain to be sent after her. Miss Wickham's compliments, and she was waiting to be read to. Miss Wickham's compliments, but did Miss Marsh know that the horses were at the door? Miss Wickham's compliments, and should she have Kate set out the backgammon board? And upon the rare occasions when there was company in the house, Miss Wickham's ingenuity in providing occupation for dear Miss Marsh while she was herself occupied with her friends was inexhaustible. In an evil hour, Nora had confessed to a modest talent for washing lace. Miss Wickham, it developed, had a really fine collection of beautiful pieces which naturally required the most delicate handling. Their need for being washed was oddly coincident with the moment when the expected guest arrived at the door. Or it appeared that the slugs had attacked the rose trees in unusual numbers. The gardener was in despair, as he was already behind with setting out the annuals. Would Miss Marsh mind, while Miss Wickham had her little after-luncheon nap? Miss Marsh did mind. She loved flowers. To arrange them was a delight, at least it had been once, but she hated slugs. But she was too young and too inexperienced to know how to combat the subtle encroachments upon her own time made by this selfish old woman. And so, gradually, she had found that she was not only companion, but a sort of superior lady's maid and assistant gardener as well, and all for £30 a year, and her keep. And alas, Prince Charming had never appeared unless, Nora laughed aloud at the thought, he had disguised himself with a cleverness defying detection. With Reginald Hornby, a callow youth, the son of Miss Wickham's dearest friend, who occasionally made the briefest of duty visits, Mr. Wynne, the family solicitor, an elderly bachelor, and the doctor's assistant, a young person by the name of Guard, Nora's list of eligible men was complete. There had been a time when Nora had flirted with the idea of escaping from bondage by becoming the wife of young Guard. He was a rather common young man, but he had been sincerely in love with her. He was not sufficiently subtle to recognize that it was the idea of escaping from Miss Wickham and the deadly monotony of her days that tempted her. He had laid his case before Miss Wickham. There had been some terrible scenes. Nora had felt the lash of her employer's bitter tongue, partly because she was still smarting from the attack, and partly because she was indignant with her suitor for having gone to Miss Wickham at all, and particularly without consulting her. She, too, had turned on the unfortunate young man. There had been mutual recriminations and reproaches, and young Guard, after his brief and bitter experience with the gentry, had left the vicinity of Tunbridge Wells, and later on married a girl of his own class. But Miss Wickham had been more shaken at the prospect of losing her young companion, who was so thoroughly broken in, than she would have liked to have confessed. She detested new faces about her, and as a matter of fact, she came as nearly caring for Nora as it was possible for her to care for any human being. She had told the girl then that it was her intention to make some provision for her at her death so that she might have a decent competence and not be obliged to look for another position. There was, of course, the implied understanding that she would remain with Miss Wickham until that lady was summoned to a better and brighter world, a step which Miss Wickham herself was in no immediate hurry to take. In the meantime, she knew perfectly well just how often a prospective legacy could be dangled before expectant eyes with perfect delicacy. It furnished her with an additional weapon, too, against her nephew, James Wickham, and his wife, both of whom she cordially detested, although she fully intended leaving them the bulk of her fortune. The consideration and tenderness she showed toward Nora when Mr. and Mrs. Wickham ran down from London to see their dear aunt showed a latent talent for comedy on the part of the chief actress of no mean order. These occasions left Nora in a state of mind in which exasperation and amusement were about equally blended. It was amusing to note the signs of apprehension on the part of Miss Wickham's disagreeable relatives as they noted their aunt's doting fondness for her hired companion, and while she felt that they richly deserved this little punishment, it was humiliating to be so cynically made use of. And now it was all over. After a year of illness and gradual decline, the end had come 2 days before. Nothing could induce Miss Wickham to have a professional nurse. The long strain and weeks of broken rest had told even on Nora's strength. Kindly Dr. Evans had insisted that she be put immediately to bed, and Kate, the parlour-maid, who had always been devoted to her, had undressed her as if she had been a baby. For the last 2 days she had done little but sleep the dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion, and today was the day of the funeral. She was just about to ring to find the time, when Kate's gentle knock came at the door. "Come in. Good morning, Kate. Do tell me the time. Oh, how good it is to be lazy once in a while." "Good morning to you, miss. I hope you're feeling a bit rested. It's just gone 11. Dr. Evans has called, miss. He told me to see if you had waked." "How good of him. Ask him to wait a few moments and I'll come right down." Coming right down was not so easy a matter as she had thought. Nora found herself strangely weak and languid. She was still sitting on the edge of her bed, trying to gather energy for the task of dressing, when Kate returned. "I beg your pardon, miss, but Dr. Evans says you're not to get up until he sees you. I'm to bring you a bit of toast and your tea and to help you freshen up a bit, and then he will come up in 20 minutes. He says to tell you that he has plenty of time." Nora made a show of protest. Secretly, she was rather glad to give in. She had not reckoned with the weakness following 2 unaccustomed days in bed. Dr. Evans was a kindly elderly man, whose one affectation was the gruffness which the country doctor of the old school so often assumes as if he wished to emphasize his disapproval of the modern suave manner of his city confrère. He had a sardonic humor and a sharp tongue, which had at first quite terrified Nora, until she discovered that they were meant to hide the most generous heart in the world. Many were the kindly acts he performed in secret for the very people he was most accustomed to abuse. Having felt Nora's pulse and looked at her sharply with his keen grey eyes, he settled the question of her attendance at Miss Wickham's funeral with his accustomed finality. "You'll do nothing of the sort," he growled. "You may get up after a while and go and sit in the garden a bit. The air is fairly spring-like. But this afternoon you must lie down again for an hour or 2. I suppose you'll have to get up to do the civil for James Wickham and his wife before they go back to town." "Oh, no, they'll not stay the night. They'll rush back as fast as the train will take them once they've heard the will read. Couldn't bear the associations with the place now that their dear aunt has departed." He gave one of his sardonic chuckles. "It may be nonsense," this in reply to Nora's remonstrance, "but I'm not going to have you on my hands next. You'll go to that funeral and get hysterical like all women and begin to think that you wish her back. I should think this last year would have been about all anyone would want. But you're a poor sentimental creature after all, he jeered. I'm nothing of the sort. But I did feel sorry for her, badly as she often treated me. She was a desperately lonely old soul. Nobody cared a bit about her, really, and she knew it. In spite of all her little amiable tricks to make people love her, said the doctor. Now remember, the garden for an hour this morning, the drawing room later in the day, after you've rested for an hour or so, and don't dare disobey me. With that, he left. It was pleasant in the garden. The air, though chilly, held the promise of spring, warmly wrapped in an old cape which the thoughtful Kate had discovered somewhere, with a book on Paris and some Italian sketches to fall back upon when her own thoughts ceased to divert her. Nora sat in a sheltered corner and looked out on the border, which would soon be gay with the tulips whose green stalks were just beginning to push themselves up through the brown earth. Poor Miss Wickham. She had been so proud of her garden always, but for her it had bloomed for the last time. Would the James Wickhams take as much pride in it? Somehow, she fancied not. And she? Where would she be a year from now? A year? Where would she be in another month? The whole world, in a modest sense, would be hers to choose from. While she had no definite notion as to the amount of her legacy, she had understood that it would bring in sufficient income to keep her from the necessity of seeking further employment. Probably something between £200 and £300 a year. She had always longed to travel. Italy, France, Germany, Spain, she would see them all. One could live very reasonably in really good pensions abroad, she had been told. And then, some day, after a few years of happy wandering, she might adventure to that far-off Canada, where her only brother was living the life of a frontiersman on an incredibly huge farm. She had not seen him for many years, but her heart warmed at the thought of seeing her only relative again. He was much older. Yes, Eddie must now be about 40. Oh, all of that. She herself was almost 28. But she wouldn't go to him for several years. He had done one thing which seemed to her quite dreadful. He had made an unfortunate marriage with a woman far beneath him socially. Men were so weak, because they fancied themselves lonely, or even captivated by a pretty face. They were willing to make impossible marriages. Women were different. Still, she had the grace to blush when she recalled the episode of the doctor's assistant. Yes, she would go out to Eddie after his wife had had the chance to form herself a little more. Living with a husband so much superior was bound to have its influence, and she must have some really good qualities at bottom, or she could never have attracted him. There was nothing vicious about her brother. She must write him of Miss Wickham's death. They were neither of them fond of writing. It must be nearly a year since she had heard from him last. And then, it was so difficult to keep up a correspondence when people had no mutual friends and so little in common. A glance at her watch told her that it must be nearly time for the London Wickhams to arrive. It would be better not to see them, unless they sent for her, until after they had returned from the cemetery. They were just the sort of people to think that she was forgetting her position if she had the manner of playing hostess by receiving them. Thank goodness. She would probably never see them again after today. With a word to Kate that she would presently have her luncheon in her room and then rest for a few hours until the people returned after the funeral, she made her way to her own bare little room. How cold and bare it was! With the exception of the framed pictures of her father and mother and a small photograph of Eddie, taken before he had gone out, there was nothing but the absolutely necessary furniture. Miss Wickham's ideas of what a companion's room should be like had partaken of the austere, and all the rest of the house was so crowded and overloaded with things. The drawing-room had always been an eyesore to Nora, crammed as it was with little tables and cabinets containing china, and in every available space There were porcelain ornaments and photographs in huge silver frames. It was all like a badly arranged museum or a huddled little curio shop. Well, she would soon be done with that too. Armed with her portfolio and writing materials, Nora returned to the guest chamber, which was her temporary abode. The motherly Kate was waiting with an appetizing lunch on a neat tray. What a good friend she had been. She would be genuinely sorry to part with Kate. She must ask her to give her some address that would always reach her. Who knew, years hence when she returned to England, but what she might afford to set up a modest flat with Kate to manage things for her. She would speak to her on the morrow, after the will was read. "Ah, Kate, you knew just what would tempt me. Thank you so much. By the way, has Miss Pringle sent any message?" "Yes, miss. Miss Pringle stopped on her way to the village a moment ago. She was with Mrs. Hubbard and had only a moment. I was to tell you that she would call this afternoon and hoped you could see her. I told her, miss, that the doctor had said you were not to go to the burial. She will come while they are away. Let me know the moment she comes. I want to see her very much." Miss Pringle was the only woman friend Nora had made in the years of her sojourn at Tunbridge Wells. They had little in common beyond the fellow-feeling that binds those in bondage. Miss Pringle was also a companion. Her taskmistress, Mrs. Hubbard, was in Nora's opinion about as stolidly brainless as a woman could well be. Miss Pringle was always lauding her kindness, but then Miss Pringle had been a companion to various rich women for 30 years. Nora had her own ideas as to the value of the opinions of any woman who had been in slavery for 30 years. Having eaten her luncheon and written her letter to her brother, she felt glad to rest once more. How wise the doctor had been to forbid her to go to the funeral, and how grateful she was that he had forbidden it, was her last waking thought. Chapter 2. It was well on to 3 o'clock when Miss Pringle made her careful way up the path that led to the late Miss Wickham's door. How strange it will be not to find her in her own drawing-room, she reflected. I don't recall that Nora Marsh and I have ever been alone together for 2 consecutive minutes in our lives. I simply couldn't have stood it. "I'll tell Miss Marsh you're here, Miss Pringle," said Kate at the door. "How is she today, Kate?" "Still tired out, poor thing. The doctor made her promise to lie down directly after she had had a bite of luncheon, but she said I was to let her know the moment you came, miss. I'm very glad she didn't go to the funeral. Dr. Evans simply wouldn't hear of it, miss. I wonder how she stood it all these months, waiting on Miss Wickham hand and foot. She should have been made to have a professional nurse." It wasn't very easy to make Miss Wickham have anything she had made up her mind not to. "You know that, miss," said Kate, as she led the way to the drawing-room. Miss Marsh slept in Miss Wickham's room towards the last, and the moment she fell asleep, Miss Wickham would have her up, because her pillow wanted shaking, or she was thirsty or something. I suppose she was very inconsiderate. Miss Pringle did not in general approve of discussing things with servants, but Nora had told her frequently how faithfully Kate looked after her and, as far as it was possible, made things bearable, so she felt she could make an exception of her. "Inconsiderate isn't the word, miss. I wouldn't be a lady's companion." Kate paused, her hand on the doorknob, to make a sweeping gesture. "Not for anything. What they have to put up with." "Everyone isn't like Miss Wickham," said Miss Pringle, a trifle sharply. "The lady I'm companion to, Mrs. Hubbard, is kindness itself." "That sounds like Miss Marsh coming down the stairs now," said Kate, opening the door. "Miss Pringle is here, miss." As Kate closed the door behind her, Nora advanced to meet her friend from the doorway with her pretty smile and outstretched hand. Miss Pringle kissed her warmly and then drew her down on a large sofa by her side. Her glance had a certain note of disapproval as it took in her friend's black dress, which did not escape that observant young person. "I was so glad to hear you were coming to me this afternoon. It is good of you. How did you escape the dragon?" She had long ago nicknamed the excellent Mrs. Hubbard the Dragon, simply to tease Miss Pringle. "Mrs. Hubbard has gone for a drive with somebody or other, and didn't want me," said Miss Pringle primly. "You haven't been crying, Nora?" "Yes, I couldn't help it. My dear, it's not unnatural." Miss Pringle dropped the hand she had been stroking to clasp both her own over the handle of her umbrella. "Well, I don't like to say anything against her now she's dead, poor thing, but Miss Wickham was the most detestable old woman I ever met." "Still," said Nora slowly, looking toward the French window which opened on the garden, at the sun streaming through the drawn blinds, "I don't suppose one can live so long with anyone and not be a little sorry to part with them forever. I was Miss Wickham's companion for 10 years. How you stood it! Exacting, domineering, disagreeable." "Yes, I suppose she was. Because she paid me a salary, she thought I wasn't a human being. I certainly never knew anyone with such a bitter tongue. At first I used to cry every night when I went to bed because of the things she said to me. But I got used to them. I wonder you didn't leave her. I would have." Miss Pringle, attempting to delude herself with the idea that she was a mettlesome, high-spirited person who would stand no nonsense, was immensely diverting to Nora. To hide an irrepressible smile, she went over to a bowl of roses, which stood on one of the little tables, and pretended to busy herself with their rearrangement. "Posts as ladies' companions are not so easy to find, I fancy. At least I remember that when I got this one, I was thought to be extremely lucky not to have to wait twice as long. I don't imagine things have bettered much in our line, do you?" "That they have not," rejoined Miss Pringle gloomily. "They tell me the agents' books are full of people wanting situations. Before I went to Mrs. Hubbard, I was out of one for nearly 2 years." Her voice shook a little at the recollection. Her poor, tired, weather-beaten face quivered as if she were about to cry. "It's not so had for you," said Nora soothingly. "You can always go and stay with your brother." "You've a brother too?" "Ah, yes. But he's farming in Canada. He has all he could do to keep himself. He couldn't keep me, too." "How is he doing now?" asked Miss Pringle, to whom any new topic of conversation was of interest. She had so little opportunity for conversation at the irreproachable Mrs. Hubbard's, that lady having apparently inherited a limited set of ideas from her late husband, as Mr. Hubbard used to say, being her favorite introduction to any topic. Miss Pringle saw herself making quite a little success at dinner that night. There was to be a guest, she believed, by saying, "A friend of mine has just been telling me of the success her brother is having way out in Canada." "He is getting on?" she asked encouragingly. "Oh, he's doing very well. He's got a farm of his own. He wrote over a few years ago and told me he could always give me a home if I wanted one." "Canada's so far off," observed Miss Pringle deprecatingly. Her tone seemed to imply that there were other disadvantages which she would refrain from mentioning. Now, while Nora had always had the same vague feeling that Canada, in addition to being an immense distance off, was not quite, well, it wasn't England, that was indisputable, she found herself unreasonably irritated by her friend's tone. "Not when yon get there," she replied sharply. Miss Pringle evidently deemed it best to change the subject. "Why don't you draw the blinds?" she asked after a moment. "It is horrid, isn't it? But somehow I thought I ought to wait till they came back from the funeral. But just see the sunlight. It must be beautiful out of doors. Why don't we walk about in the garden? Do you care for a wrap? I'll send Kate to fetch you something if you do." Miss Pringle, having decided that her coat was sufficiently warm if they did not sit anywhere too long, and just walked in the paths where it was sure not to be damp, they went out of the gloomy drawing-room into the bright afternoon sunshine. "Don't you love a garden when things are just beginning to show their heads? I sometimes think that spring is the most beautiful of all the seasons. It's like watching the birth of a new world. I think the most human thing about poor Miss Wickham was her fondness for flowers, She always said she hoped she'd never die in winter. To Miss Pringle, the note of regret, which crept now and again into Nora's voice when she spoke of her late employer, was a continual source of bewilderment. Here was a woman who she knew had a quick temper and a passionate nature, speaking as if she actually sorrowed for the tyrant who had so frequently made her life unbearable. She was sure that she couldn't have felt more grieved if Providence had seen fit to remove the excellent Mrs. Hubbard from the scene of her earthly activities. Poor Miss Pringle. She did not realize that after 30 years of a life passed as a hired companion, that she no longer possessed either sensibility or the power of affection. To her, one employer would be very like another, so long as they were fairly considerate and not too unreasonable. It would be tiresome, to be sure, to have to learn the little likes and dislikes of Mrs. Hubbard's successor. But what would you? Life was filled with tiresome moments. Poor Miss Pringle. Her next remark was partly to make conversation, and partly because she might obtain further light upon this perplexing subject. She made a mental note that she must not forget to speak to Mrs. Hubbard of Nora's grief over Miss Wickham's death. Naturally, she would be gratified. "Well, it must be a great relief to you now it's all over," she said. "Sometimes I can't realize it," said Nora simply. "These last few weeks I hardly got to bed at all, and when the end came, I was utterly exhausted. For 2 days I have done nothing but sleep. Poor Miss Wickham, she did hate dying." Miss Pringle had a sort of triumph. She had proved her point. Even Mrs. Hubbard could not doubt it now. "That's the extraordinary part of it. I believe you were really fond of her. Do you know that for nearly a year she would eat nothing but what I gave her with my own hands, and she liked me as much as she was capable of liking anybody?" "That wasn't much," Miss Pringle permitted herself. "And then I was so dreadfully sorry for her. Good heavens! She'd been a hard and selfish woman all her life, and there was no one who cared for her," Nora went on passionately. "It seemed so dreadful to die like that and leave not a soul to regret one. Her nephew and his wife were just waiting for her death. It was dreadful. Each time they came down from London, I could see them looking at her to see if she was any worse than when last they'd seen her." "Well," said Miss Pringle with a sort of splendid defiance, "I thought her a horrid old woman, and I'm glad she's dead, and I only hope she's left you well provided for." "Oh, I think she's done that." Nora smiled happily into her friend's face. "Yes, I can be quite sure of that, I fancy. 2 years ago, when I nearly went away, she said she'd left me enough to live on." They walked on for a moment or two in silence until they had reached the end of the path, where there was a little arbour in which Miss Wickham had been in the habit of having her tea afternoons when the weather permitted. "Do you think we would run any risk if we sat down here a few moments? Suppose we try it. We can walk again if you feel in the least chilled. I think the view's so lovely from here. Besides, I can see the carriage the moment it enters the gate." Miss Pringle sat down with the air of a person who was hardly conscious of what she was doing. "You say she told you she had left you something when you nearly went away," she went on in the hesitating manner of one who has been interrupted while reading aloud and is not quite sure that she has resumed at the right place. "You mean when that assistant of Dr. Evans wanted to marry you? I'm glad you wouldn't have him." "He was very kind and nice," said Nora gently. "But of course, he wasn't a gentleman." "I shouldn't like to live with a man at all," retorted Miss Pringle with unshakable conviction. "I think they're horrid, but of course it would be utterly impossible if he weren't a gentleman." Nora's eyes twinkled with amusement. She gave a little gurgle of laughter. "He came to see Miss Wickham, but she wouldn't have anything to do with him. First, she said she couldn't spare me, and then she said that I had a very bad temper." "I like her saying that," retorted her listener. "It's quite true," said Nora with a deprecating wave of her hand. "Every now and then I felt I couldn't put up with her any more. I forgot that I was dependent on her and that if she dismissed me, I probably shouldn't be able to find another situation, and I just flew at her. I must say she was very nice about it. She used to look at me and grin, and when it was all over, say, "My dear, when you marry, if your husband's a wise man, he'll use a big stick now and then." "Old cat. I should like to see any man try it," said Nora with emphasis. Miss Pringle dismissed the supposition with a wave of her hand. "How much do you think she's left you?" she asked eagerly. "Nada. Well, of course I don't know. The will is going to be read this afternoon when they come back from the funeral. But from what she said, I believe about £250 a year. It's the least she could do. She's had the 10 best years of your life." Nora gave a long, happy sigh. Just think of it. Never to be at anybody's beck and call again. I shall be able to get up when I like and go to bed when I like, go out when I choose and come in when I choose. Think of what that means. "Unless you marry, you probably will," said Miss Pringle in a discouraging tone. "Never. What do you purpose doing?" "I shall go to Italy, Florence, Rome, oh, everywhere I've so longed to go. Do you think it's horrible of me? I'm so happy." "My dear child," said Miss Pringle with real feeling. At that moment, the sound of carriage wheels came to them. Turning quickly, Nora saw the carriage containing Master and Mrs. Wickham coming up the drive. "There they are now. How the time has gone." "I'd better go, hadn't I?" said Miss Pringle with manifest reluctance. "I'm afraid you must. I'm sorry." "Couldn't I go up to your room and wait there?" "I do so want to know about the will." Nora hesitated a moment. She didn't want to take Miss Pringle up to her bare little room. A sort of loyalty to the woman who was, after all, to be her benefactress. For was she not, after all, with her legacy, going to make the happy future pay rich interest for the unhappy past? Made her reluctant to let anyone know how poorly she had been lodged. "No," she said. "I'll tell you what, stay here in the garden. They want to catch the 4-something back to London, and later we can have a cosy little tea all by ourselves." "Very well." "Oh, my dear," said Miss Pringle with emotion, "I'm so sincerely happy in your good luck." Nora was genuinely moved. She leaned over and kissed Miss Pringle, her eyes filling with quick tears. Then she went into the house. The Wickhams were already in the drawing-room. Mrs. James Wickham was a pretty young woman, a good 10 years younger than her unattractive husband. Of the two, Nora preferred Mr. Wickham. There was a certain cynicism about her insincerity which his somehow lacked. Even now, they wore their rue with a difference. Mrs. Wickham's mourning was as correct and elegant as a fashionable dressmaker could make it, the very latest thing in grief. Mr. Wickham was far less sumptuous. Beyond the customary band on his hat and a pair of black gloves conspicuously new, he had apparently made little expenditure on his costume. As Nora entered, Mrs. Wickham was pulling off her gloves. "How do you do?" she said carelessly. "Ouf! Do put the blinds up, Miss Marsh. Really, we needn't be depressed any more. Jim, if you love me, take those gloves off. They're perfectly revolting." "Why, what's wrong with them? The fellow in the shop told me they were the right thing." "No doubt. I never saw anyone look quite so funereal as you do." "Well," retorted her husband, "you didn't want me to get myself up as if I were going to a wedding, did you?" "Were there many people?" said Nora hastily. The insolence of Mrs. Wickham's glance was scarcely veiled. "Oh, quite a lot," she drawled. "The sort of people who indulge in other people's funerals as a mild form of dissipation." "I hope Wynne will look sharp," said her husband hastily, looking at his watch. "I don't want to miss that train." "Who were all those stodgy old things who wrung your hand afterwards, Jim?" asked his wife. She was moving slowly about the room, picking up the various little objects scattered about and examining the contents of one of the cabinets with the air of an appraiser. "I can't think. They did make me feel such a fool." "Oh, was that it?" laughed his wife. I saw you looking a perfect owl, and I thought you were giving a very bad imitation of restrained emotion. Dorothy, in a tone of remonstrance. Would you care for some tea, Mrs. Wickham? Nora broke in. To her, the whole scene was positively indecent. She longed to make her escape, but felt that it would be considered part of her duty to remain as long as the Wickhams stayed. As she was about to ring the bell, Mrs. Wickham stopped her with a gesture. Well, you might send some in so that it'll be ready when Mr. Wynne comes. We'll ring for you, shall we? She added. I dare say you've got one or two things you want to do now. Very good, Mrs. Wickham. Nora could feel her cheeks burn as she left the room. But she was thankful to escape. Outside the door, she hesitated for a moment. There was no good in rejoining Miss Pringle as yet. She had no news for her. She hoped Mr. Wynne would not be delayed much longer. The Wickhams could not possibly be more anxious to get back to London than she was to have them go. How gratuitously insolent that woman was. Thank heaven, she need never see her again after today. Of course, she was furious because she suspected that the despised companion was to be a beneficiary under the will. How could anyone be so mean as to begrudge her her well-earned share in so large a fortune? Well, the coming hour would tell the tale. On the table in her room was the letter to her brother which she had forgotten to send to the post. Slipping down the stairs again, she went in search of Kate to see if it were too late to send it to the village. Now that it was written, she had almost a superstitions feeling that it was important that it should catch the first foreign mail. As she passed the door of the drawing-room, she could hear James Wickham's voice raised above its normal pitch. Were they already quarrelling over the spoils?